The thermometer outside Klaus Eisenhardt's cabin read -37 degrees on that January morning in 1842. But inside, near the massive black stone structure dominating one wall, the air held steady at 72 degrees. His neighbor Samuel Crawford had burned through half his winter woodpile in 3 weeks and still woke each morning to ice forming on the inside of his cabin walls. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Samuel Crawford's hands were the color of old meat when he knocked on Klaus Eisenhardt's door that January morning. Klaus opened it to find his neighbor swaying slightly, ice crystals clinging to his beard, eyes showing that particular glaze that came before hypothermia took full hold. Samuel had walked the quarter-mile between their cabins through snow that came past his knees, driven by desperation that overrode pride. Klaus pulled him inside without a word, closed the door against the wind that tried to follow them in, and guided Samuel toward the enormous dark structure that occupied nearly a fifth of the cabin's interior space. The warmth hit Samuel like something physical. He had been cold for so long, weeks of it, that heat felt foreign against his skin. His cabin, built the previous summer using every technique the other Montana Territory settlers had taught him, leaked warmth like a sieve. He fed his fireplace constantly, burning through logs with alarming speed, and still woke each night shaking so hard his teeth clattered. But Klaus's cabin felt like summer. Samuel stood near the massive stone structure, not quite touching it yet, his mind struggling to reconcile what his body felt with what he knew about winter survival in the territories. Klaus poured coffee from a pot that sat on the flat top surface of the stone structure, still hot from the morning fire that had burned hours earlier. He handed the tin cup to Samuel and watched as his neighbor's hand slowly regained function enough to grip it. The stone structure radiated heat in waves, steady and even. Nothing like the fierce proximity heat of Samuel's fireplace that burned your front while your back froze. This was different. This was heat that filled space, that maintained itself, that asked for nothing in return. Samuel finally spoke, his voice rough. How? The single word carried everything he needed to ask. How was this cabin so warm? How was Klaus not burning through wood like every other settler? How was this possible when Samuel was doing everything right, everything the experienced trappers had taught him, and still losing the battle against winter? Klaus gestured toward the stone structure. My grandmother had one in Bavaria, he said. Called it a Kachelofen. We call it a black stove here because of the dark stone. He moved closer to the structure, placing his palm flat against the surface. I built it last year. Took me 3 months. Everyone thought I was crazy. Samuel noticed the slight smile on Klaus's face when he said that last part, not bitter, just acknowledging a fact. The stone structure was unlike anything Samuel had seen. It rose from floor to ceiling, maybe 7 feet tall, built from dark gray stone that looked almost black in the cabin's dim light. The front featured a firebox with an arched opening, cold now but showing evidence of the morning fire in the ash bed. Above the firebox, the structure extended backward into the cabin, its mass taking up space that Samuel would have used for sleeping or storage. Decorative panels covered the surface, geometric patterns that seemed purely ornamental. The top was flat, serving as a warming surface for the coffee pot and several other containers. The whole thing had to weigh thousands of pounds. I fired it twice yesterday, Klaus said. Once at dawn, once at dusk. Won't need another fire until tonight. He watched Samuel process this information. My woodpile will last all winter. Yours? Samuel didn't answer because they both knew. He would run out by February if the cold held. Klaus Eisenhardt had been 8 years old the first time he understood what his grandmother's Kachelofen truly meant for survival. The winter of 1823 had been brutal across Bavaria. snow piling so high that second-story windows disappeared beneath drifts. His family's stone house in the village of Rothenburg held 12 people that season, relatives who had abandoned their own homes when firewood ran out and cold became deadly. They survived because of the massive tiled stove that stood in the center of the main room, a structure his great-grandfather had built 60 years earlier. Klaus remembered watching his father fire that stove each morning and evening. The ritual never varied. His father would build a small, intensely hot fire using split oak, never green wood, never damp fuel. The fire would burn for perhaps an hour, flames roaring in the firebox with a sound like wind through a canyon. Then his father would close the door and adjust the dampers, and the fire would consume itself completely, leaving only fine ash. The heat would spread through the stone mass, and the house would stay warm for the next 12 hours. Klaus had taken it for granted then, the way children accept miracles as ordinary facts of life. His grandmother, already old when Klaus was born, had taught him the principle behind it. She was the only person in the family who understood the engineering, knowledge passed down from the mason who built it. "Stone remembers heat," she told him one afternoon as they sat beside the warm mass. "Wood burns fast and throws heat away. Stone catches that heat and holds it like a miser holds gold. Slow to warm, slow to cool. That is the secret." She had placed his small hand against the tiles, and he felt the steady warmth radiating outward. "Your great-grandfather built this to outlive him. It will outlive you, too." When Klaus left for America in 1837 at age 22, he carried little with him. A few tools, basic supplies, enough money to reach the frontier, and the memory of that stove. He had not thought much about it during his first years in the territories. He worked as a trapper, moving frequently, sleeping in temporary shelters or under the sky. Heat came from campfires, adequate for a young man in constant motion. But when he decided to establish a permanent claim in the Montana Territory in 1840, building a cabin that would shelter him through winters, the memory returned with force. He had watched other settlers build their cabins that first summer. They used open fireplaces, the English style that Americans favored. Simple construction, quick to build, adequate by local standards. Klaus built one too, following the pattern everyone used. He spent that first winter feeding it constantly, burning through wood with shocking speed, waking every few hours to add fuel or freezing in his sleep. By spring, he knew the American method was wrong. Not wrong for America necessarily, but wrong for survival. His grandmother's voice came back to him across the years and ocean. "Stone remembers heat." The winter of 1840 to 1841 taught Klaus Eisenhardt that frontier wisdom was not always wise. He had built his first cabin following advice from experienced settlers, men who had survived multiple Montana winters and considered themselves experts in mountain living. They showed him how to construct a serviceable fireplace using river stones and mud mortar. They explained the importance of a good draw, a proper chimney height, a firebox large enough to handle substantial logs. They assured him this was how men stayed alive in the territories, and Klaus, newly arrived and unfamiliar with American methods, trusted their experience. The fireplace worked exactly as designed, which was the problem. It consumed wood with relentless efficiency, turning logs into heat that rose straight up the chimney and disappeared into the night sky. Klaus would build a fire at dusk, feeding it until the cabin felt almost comfortable. Within an hour of banking the coals and trying to sleep, the cold would begin its return. By midnight, he could see his breath. By dawn, water in his bucket showed ice at the edges. He learned to sleep in every piece of clothing he owned, wrapped in blankets and furs, positioned as close to the fireplace as possible without risking burns. The wood consumption staggered him. He had cut and stacked what he thought was a generous supply during the autumn months, enough to see him through until spring. By January, he realized his estimate was dangerously optimistic. A single day required 20 to 30 logs depending on their size and the outdoor temperature. A week consumed more wood than he had burned in an entire month back in Bavaria. He spent hours each day cutting more, hauling it through snow, splitting it into manageable pieces. The labor left him exhausted, which made him sleep more deeply, which meant the fire would die completely overnight, which made mornings brutal. Other settlers assured him this was normal. Everyone burned through wood rapidly. Everyone woke to frozen water buckets. Everyone spent half their winter cutting more fuel. This was the cost of mountain living, they said, the price of freedom and opportunity. Men tougher than Klaus had endured worse. He should stop complaining and keep his axe sharp. Klaus said nothing in response, but he thought about his grandmother's house, warm all winter on a fraction of the wood he was burning. He thought about the principle she had taught him. Stone remembers heat. Americans built their fires to heat air, and air had no memory at all. The final week of February brought temperatures that dropped below -20 and stayed there. Klaus burned wood constantly, maintaining fire day and night, barely sleeping. His woodpile shrank at a terrifying rate. He calculated remaining supply against remaining winter and realized he might not make it. On the 1st of March, he made a decision that felt like admitting defeat. He abandoned his cabin and moved to the settlement 20 miles away, where he could share heating costs with others in a boarding house. His claim remained secure, but his first winter had beaten him. The American way had failed, at least for Klaus. He would not make the same mistake twice. Klaus returned to his Montana claim in April of 1841 with a partner. Thomas Macklin was a Virginia man, 10 years older than Klaus, experienced in frontier living, and eager to establish a trapping operation in territory that still held good beaver populations. They had met in the settlement during Klaus's winter retreat, discovered compatible temperaments, and agreed to pool resources for mutual benefit. Thomas had survival skills Klaus lacked. Klaus had saved money Thomas needed. The partnership made practical sense, and both men approached it with realistic expectations and clear terms. They spent the spring improving Klaus's cabin, making it suitable for 2 occupants. Thomas showed Klaus how to build a proper sleeping platform, how to construct adequate storage, how to weatherproof gaps in the log walls. They extended the roof line to create a covered area for wood cutting and storage. Thomas examined Klaus's fireplace and declared it well-built, functional, sufficient for their needs. Klaus said nothing about his previous winter's struggle. Thomas was the expert in American frontier methods, and Klaus was still learning. They prepared for the coming winter with confidence that came from Thomas's experience and Klaus's determination not to fail a second time. The trapping that summer and fall went well. They worked different sections of the creek systems, checking trap lines in rotation, processing pelts efficiently, building a supply that would bring good money come spring. Thomas proved to be steady, reliable, fair in dividing labor and profits. Klaus learned quickly, and Thomas was a patient teacher. By November, they had established an effective routine and stocked the cabin with adequate supplies for winter. They cut an enormous wood pile, twice what Klaus had prepared the previous year, and Thomas assured him it would be sufficient. They settled in as the first snows arrived, confident in their preparations. The cold came early that year. By mid-December, temperatures were dropping to -30 regularly. Klaus and Thomas fell into a pattern of constant fire maintenance that Klaus remembered too well from the previous winter. They took shifts through the night, one man sleeping while the other kept the fire going. It was exhausting, but necessary. Thomas never complained, treating it as normal winter routine. Klaus burned through their carefully prepared woodpile and watched it diminish with familiar dread. They began cutting more in January, working in brutal cold to replenish supply. On the morning of February 3, 1841, Klaus woke to discover Thomas had not woken him for his fire-tending shift. The cabin was bitterly cold, the fire reduced to dead ash. Klaus called Thomas's name and received no response. He found his partner on the sleeping platform, still wrapped in blankets, his skin the color of old snow. Thomas had simply not woken up. The cold had taken him during the night while Klaus slept, both of them exhausted from weeks of inadequate rest and constant labor. There was no violence, no drama, just a man going to sleep and not waking. Klaus buried Thomas when the ground thawed in April. He marked the grave carefully and sat beside it for a long time, thinking about his grandmother's stove. Klaus announced his intention to build a German heating stove in late April of 1841, 3 weeks after burying Thomas Macklin. He mentioned it casually during a supply run to the settlement, explaining his plans to the handful of trappers and settlers who gathered at the trading post. The response was immediate and unified. They thought he had lost his mind. Samuel Crawford, who would later stand shivering in Klaus's warm cabin, was among the loudest skeptics that day. He pointed out that Klaus's perfectly functional fireplace had served men for generations across the entire American frontier. Why would anyone tear out working equipment to install some foreign contraption that nobody had ever seen? Klaus tried to explain the principle. Stone captured heat that fireplaces threw away. A properly built masonry heater could warm a cabin for 12 hours from a single firing. It used a fraction of the wood that open fires consumed. His grandmother's house in Bavaria had stayed comfortable all winter while neighbors with conventional heating froze. The trappers listened with expressions that ranged from polite confusion to open amusement. One man, a weathered Kentuckian named Porter, finally spoke what others were thinking. Germans might do things differently back in the old country, but this was America, and American methods worked fine for American problems. The criticism intensified when Klaus described the construction requirements. The stove would take up significant interior space, perhaps a fifth of his cabin's total area. It would weigh several tons, requiring reinforced flooring. It would take months to build, time Klaus could spend trapping or improving other aspects of his claim. Most damning, it would require specialized masonry skills that Klaus admitted he only partially possessed. He would be learning as he built, risking months of labor on an experimental structure that might not work at all. Porter shook his head slowly. "Son, you're talking about gambling your whole summer on building a brick pile. That's not frontier thinking. That's foolishness dressed up as engineering." Samuel Crawford added his own concerns. Even if the stove worked as Klaus claimed, which seemed doubtful, the resource investment made no sense. A man could cut extra firewood in the time it took to build such a structure. The wood was free, available everywhere, renewable each year. Stone had to be found, evaluated, transported, shaped, and assembled with precision. The comparison favored wood by any practical measure. Klaus was proposing to solve a manageable problem by creating a more difficult one. Other men nodded agreement. This was the consensus of experienced frontiersmen, men who had survived conditions that killed weaker settlers. Their skepticism carried weight. Klaus purchased his supplies anyway. He bought tools for stonework, materials for mortar, iron hardware for dampers and doors. The trading post operator, a practical man named Henderson, tried one last time to talk sense into him. "Klaus, I'll sell you whatever you want, but I'm telling you as a friend, you're wasting money and time. Winter comes whether you're ready or not. Build something proven." Klaus paid for his supplies and loaded them onto his pack horse. He had made his decision. Klaus began searching for suitable stone in early May of 1841, knowing he needed specific characteristics that most rock would not provide. His grandmother had explained this during one of their conversations beside the Kachelofen, her hands tracing the tiles as she spoke. Not all stone held heat equally. Dense stone with tight grain captured warmth and released it slowly. Porous stone or rock with internal fractures would crack under thermal stress, failing catastrophically when heated repeatedly. Color mattered less than density, though darker stone generally absorbed heat more efficiently. Klaus needed to find deposits that met these requirements within reasonable hauling distance of his cabin. He spent 3 weeks exploring the creek valleys and hillsides around his claim, examining exposed rock faces, testing samples with techniques his grandmother had taught him. He would strike a stone sharply with a hammer, listening to the sound it produced. Clear, ringing tones indicated dense structure. Dull thuds suggested internal weaknesses or porous composition. He looked for stone that broke with smooth fractures rather than crumbling or shattering. He tested weight by comparing similar size samples, knowing that heavier stone typically held more thermal mass. The work was tedious and required judgment that came from experience Klaus was still developing. He made mistakes, collecting samples that later proved unsuitable, learning through trial and error. The best deposit he found was 3 miles from his cabin, a dark gray sandstone exposed in a creek bank where erosion had revealed a substantial vein. The stone had the density Klaus needed, broke cleanly when worked, and existed in quantities sufficient for his project. The color was nearly black when wet, lighter gray when dry, but consistently dark enough to serve his purposes. The deposit's distance from his cabin meant hauling would be laborious, but Klaus had expected that. Good building stone was rarely conveniently located. He marked the site and began planning his extraction and transport strategy. Other settlers occasionally passed by during Klaus's stone-gathering phase and invariably stopped to watch him work. Their comments followed predictable patterns. Why was he hauling rocks when he should be trapping? Why was he being so selective when stone was stone? Why was he investing so much effort in building material when logs were everywhere and required less specialized knowledge? Klaus answered politely when pressed, but mostly worked in silence. He was learning that frontier culture valued speed and pragmatism over careful preparation. Men built cabins in days, not months. They used available materials with minimal processing. They favored solutions that worked adequately over solutions that worked optimally. Klaus's approach violated all these principles, and his neighbors made sure he knew it. By mid-June, Klaus had transported enough stone to his cabin site to begin construction. The pile represented hundreds of hours of searching, testing, extracting, and hauling. Each stone had been individually evaluated and selected. The collection sat near his cabin like evidence of obsession, a monument to effort that seemed disproportionate to any reasonable goal. Samuel Crawford stopped by one afternoon and stood looking at the stone pile for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Klaus, it's not too late to admit this was a bad idea." The cabin floor Klaus had built the previous year would not support the weight he planned to place on it. Standard frontier cabin construction used packed earth or, at best, rough wooden planks laid directly on ground. Such flooring adequately supported furniture, supplies, and human occupants. It would not support 3 tons of stone without settling, shifting, or failing completely. Klaus needed to create a foundation within his existing cabin, a reinforced base that would distribute the massive weight across a larger area and prevent catastrophic structural failure. This meant tearing up a section of his floor and building from the ground up. He began by removing floorboards in the area where the stove would stand, exposing the earth beneath. Then he excavated, digging down 2 feet in a rectangular area slightly larger than the stove's planned footprint. The hole measured 8 feet by 6 feet, and removing that much earth from inside his cabin was awkward work in confined space. He hauled the dirt outside in buckets, creating a growing pile that his neighbors eyed with continuing bewilderment. Porter stopped by during this phase and asked what Klaus was building. When Klaus explained it was the foundation for his heating stove, Porter laughed outright. "You're digging a cellar for a fireplace. Son, that's insane even by your standards." Klaus ignored the commentary and continued working. He lined the excavation bottom with flat stones, creating a level base layer. Then he began filling the hole with carefully placed rocks, fitting them together to create a solid mass. This was not random rubble fill. Each stone was positioned to bear weight effectively, with larger stones at the bottom and smaller ones filling gaps. Klaus worked methodically, testing stability as he built upward, ensuring that no voids or weak points existed in the foundation mass. The process took a full week, and by the end, he had created a stone foundation that extended from 2 feet below ground level to just above the original cabin floor. Over this foundation, Klaus built a platform using thick planks he had prepared specifically for this purpose. The planks were oak, dense and strong, laid across the foundation mass and pegged together to create a solid working surface. This platform would serve as the base for the stove itself, distributing its weight across the entire foundation rather than concentrating it on a few points. The engineering was sound, borrowed from principles Klaus had observed in European construction, but it looked absurdly overbuilt by frontier standards. He had spent 2 weeks creating a foundation for a heating device, time that could have produced dozens of other improvements to his claim. Samuel Crawford visited again near the end of the foundation work. He examined what Klaus had built with the expression of a man watching someone commit elaborate suicide. "You've put more work into preparing for this stove than most men put into entire cabins," Samuel said. "What happens when you finish and it doesn't work?" Klaus, fitting the final platform planks, responded without looking up. "Then I'll have learned something valuable about thermal mass and masonry." Klaus began building the firebox in early July, working from memory and principles rather than detailed plans. His grandmother's Kachelofen had featured a small, precisely engineered combustion chamber where wood burned at extremely high temperatures. The size mattered critically. American fireplaces were large, designed to hold massive logs that burned slowly throughout the day and night. Klaus's firebox would be perhaps 1/4 that size, maybe 18 inches wide, 20 inches deep, 12 inches tall. The confined space would force complete combustion, burning wood entirely to ash while generating intense heat that the surrounding stone mass would capture and store. He built the firebox walls using his densest stones, selecting pieces that would withstand repeated heating and cooling cycles without cracking. The interior surfaces needed to be as smooth as possible to promote proper airflow and prevent ash accumulation in corners. Klaus shaped each stone carefully using his hammer and chisel, working with patience that felt foreign to frontier building culture. His neighbors built entire structures in the time he spent perfecting a single component. But Klaus understood that the firebox was the heart of the entire system. If it failed, everything failed. The arch over the firebox opening presented his first serious technical challenge. Arched construction required precise stone placement and temporary support during building. Klaus constructed a wooden form, essentially a curved template that would hold the arch stones in position until the mortar set. He had watched masons build arches in Bavaria, but had never attempted one himself. His first effort collapsed when he removed the wooden support too early. The mortar had not fully cured, and the stones fell inward, destroying hours of careful work. Klaus rebuilt the form, positioned the stones again, and this time waited a full week before removing support. The arch held. The mortar Klaus used was not standard frontier mud and lime mixture. He had experimented for days during his stone gathering phase, testing different combinations of clay, sand, and water. The mortar needed to withstand extreme heat without cracking or crumbling, while also bonding strongly to stone surfaces. He eventually developed a mixture that included clay from the creek bank, sharp sand, and a small amount of ash from his fireplace. The ash provided lime content that improved bonding strength. His grandmother had never explained mortar composition in detail, so Klaus was working from partial knowledge and considerable trial and error. Inside the firebox, Klaus created a raised grate area where wood would rest during burning. The grate sat on small stone supports, elevating fuel above the firebox floor and allowing air to circulate underneath. This promoted more complete combustion by ensuring oxygen could reach all surfaces of burning wood. Ash would fall through gaps in the grate to the floor below, where Klaus could remove it through a small clean-out door he positioned at the firebox base. The entire firebox assembly, when completed in late July, looked absurdly small compared to standard frontier fireplaces. Samuel Crawford examined it and pronounced it inadequate to heat anything larger than a chicken coop. Klaus just nodded and continued working. The innovation that separated a masonry heater from a simple stone fireplace existed in the invisible pathways Klaus built into the structure's interior. These channels, called flues, would force hot smoke and gases to travel horizontally through the stone mass before exiting through the chimney. Every foot of travel meant more heat transferred from smoke to stone, captured and stored rather than wasted. Klaus's grandmother had explained this principle using a simple metaphor. A straight chimney was like throwing gold coins out a window. A channel system was like making those coins work for you before letting them go. Klaus began building the first horizontal channel directly behind the firebox, creating a passage approximately 6 inches tall and the full width of the structure. Stone slabs formed the channel floor and ceiling, with vertical stones creating the walls. The passage needed to be large enough for smoke to flow freely without creating back pressure that would force smoke into the cabin, but small enough that heat transfer to surrounding stone was maximized. Klaus had no precise measurements to guide him, only the memory of his grandmother's descriptions and his own reasoning about fluid dynamics he barely understood. The first channel connected to a vertical passage that rose about 2 feet, then turned into a second horizontal channel running parallel to the first, but in the opposite direction. This created a switchback pattern, forcing smoke to travel back and forth through the stone mass in a serpentine path. Klaus built 3 horizontal channels in total, each separated by vertical connectors, creating a maze that smoke had to navigate before reaching the chimney. The engineering was more complex than anything Klaus had attempted previously. Each channel had to maintain proper slope for draft, connect smoothly to the next section to prevent turbulence, and integrate structurally with the surrounding masonry. The challenge was building these internal passages while simultaneously constructing the external walls. Klaus had to work from bottom to top, completing one level entirely before starting the next, because he needed to place channel ceiling stones that also served as floor stones for the level above. The work required constant 3-dimensional visualization, imagining the invisible smoke path while building the visible structure around it. He made mistakes. A channel section he built in early August had insufficient slope and would have created a trap for creosote buildup. Klaus discovered the error through careful measurement and tore out a full day's work to rebuild it correctly. Porter visited during the channel construction phase and asked Klaus to explain what he was building. Klaus tried to describe the internal passages, the smoke path, the heat transfer principle. Porter listened patiently, then delivered his assessment. "You're building a stone puzzle that might collapse on itself, trap smoke, fill your cabin with fumes, or just sit there doing nothing while you freeze next winter. This is the most complicated way to fail I've ever seen." Klaus acknowledged that Porter might be right. He was working from incomplete knowledge and considerable guesswork. But the alternative was building another American fireplace and burning Thomas Macklin's fate into reality. Klaus would rather fail attempting something better than succeed at something inadequate. By mid-August of 1841, Klaus's stove had risen to waist height, and the physical reality of what he was building began to dominate his cabin's interior space. The structure measured 6 feet wide at its base, 4 feet deep, and was growing taller with each layer of stone. Other settlers who visited could now see the full scope of Klaus's project, and their mockery evolved from casual dismissal to genuine concern that he was wasting his future on obsessive foolishness. The trapping season was entering its crucial period. Men were checking trap lines, processing pelts, building inventory that would convert to money the following spring. Klaus was stacking rocks. The construction consumed every daylight hour. Klaus would wake at dawn, eat a cold breakfast, and begin working. Each stone required individual attention. He would test fit it in position, remove it, shape it if necessary using hammer and chisel, apply mortar, replace it, check level and alignment, then move to the next stone. The pace was glacial by any measure. On a productive day, Klaus might add 3 full courses of stone to the structure's height, perhaps 10 inches of vertical progress. On difficult days, when stones refused to fit properly, or mortar consistency was wrong, or fatigue made his hands clumsy, he might complete only a single course. The stove grew like a geological formation, measured in inches per week rather than feet per day. The weight was becoming substantial. Klaus estimated he had already positioned roughly 2 tons of stone, and the structure was perhaps half finished. The reinforced foundation he had built was proving necessary. Standard cabin flooring would have collapsed weeks earlier under this load. Even with proper foundation, Klaus could hear his cabin floor joists creaking under the strain, timbers adjusting to weight they were never designed to carry. He added additional support posts under the floor from outside, bracing the structure's underside to prevent sagging. This required crawling beneath the cabin in the confined space between ground and floorboards, working in near darkness to position and secure the posts. Another week of labor on supporting infrastructure. Porter brought 3 other trappers to see Klaus's project in late August. They stood in the cabin doorway, filling the space, studying the enormous stone mass that now dominated the interior. One man, a French-Canadian named Duchamp, spoke limited English, but his expression communicated clearly. He thought Klaus was building a tomb, not a heater. Porter tried once more to inject reason into the situation. "Klaus, you've got maybe 6 weeks before serious cold arrives. You haven't trapped all summer. You've got no pelts to sell, no income for next year, and you're building something that's taken up half your cabin. At what point do you admit this isn't working?" Klaus, mixing mortar, responded without stopping his work. "When I freeze to death next winter, you can say you were right." The trappers left, shaking their heads. That evening, Samuel Crawford stopped by with a proposition. He would help Klaus cut firewood, enough to get through winter using a conventional fireplace, if Klaus would abandon the stove project and focus on survival. Klaus thanked him for the concern, but declined. He was committed now, not just to the stove, but to proving that knowledge from another place could solve problems American methods could not. The ornamental relief panels Klaus carved into the stove's exterior surface served a purpose beyond aesthetics, though his neighbors saw only unnecessary decoration on an already absurd project. Each panel featured geometric patterns, squares and diamonds and interlocking rectangles, carved perhaps half an inch deep into the stone faces. Klaus worked on these panels during September, using chisels and patience to create texture across the stove's visible surfaces. Samuel Crawford asked why Klaus was wasting time making his heating experiment pretty when functionality should be the only concern. Klaus explained that the carved surface increased the total area exposed to the cabin's air, creating more contact points for heat transfer. Samuel looked skeptical. It seemed like rationalization for vanity. The truth was more complex than Klaus articulated. The panels did increase surface area, but marginally. Their greater value was psychological. Klaus was building something that looked intentional, crafted, permanent. The decorative work transformed the stove from an experimental pile of rocks into a structure that commanded respect through its evident craft. Klaus understood, even if he could not explain it clearly, that people judged innovation partly on appearance. A crude structure that worked poorly confirmed skeptics' doubts. A beautiful structure that worked poorly at least demonstrated serious effort. And if it worked well, the beauty became proof of superior knowledge rather than wasted labor. The carving also gave Klaus time to observe his work from a perspective other than urgent construction. He would spend hours carefully shaping a single panel, and during that meditative work, he could study the stove's proportions, visualize smoke flow through the internal channels, consider whether modifications were needed. Several times during September, Klaus identified problems through this careful observation. A channel connection that looked adequate during hurried construction showed potential restriction when examined closely. A section of mortar that had seemed properly applied revealed hairline cracks that needed repair. The decorative work slowed construction, but improved quality. Porter arrived one afternoon with a bottle of whiskey and sat watching Klaus carve. After a long silence, Porter spoke. "You know what they're calling this in the settlement? Eisenhardt's Castle. They're making jokes about how you're building a fortress to fight winter." Klaus continued carving without responding. Porter took a drink and tried again. "I'm not mocking you, Klaus. I'm trying to understand what drives a man to this. You've invested 4 months in something that might not work. That's not normal stubbornness. That's something else." Klaus set down his chisel and looked at Porter directly. "My partner died because we couldn't keep a cabin warm. Thomas Macklin froze in his sleep because American heating methods are inadequate for this climate. I'm building this so I don't die the same way. If that seems crazy to you, then you didn't really know Thomas." Porter nodded slowly, finished his whiskey, and left without another word. Klaus returned to his carving, creating beauty on a structure built from tragedy. Klaus completed the main structure on October 2, 1841, sealing the final stone into place at the top of the chimney as autumn color spread across the Montana hillsides. The stove stood 7 feet tall, a massive, dark presence that occupied roughly 1/5 of his cabin's interior. It had consumed 5 months of continuous labor, thousands of pounds of carefully selected stone, and every bit of Klaus's limited masonry skill. Now came the moment when theory met reality. He needed to test whether the structure worked, whether smoke would flow properly through the internal channels, whether the mass would actually capture and hold heat, or whether he had built an elaborate failure. He prepared carefully for the first test fire. He gathered dry kindling and split wood from pine, selecting pieces small enough to fit the compact firebox. He opened all dampers and checked that the chimney cap was clear. He positioned himself where he could quickly exit the cabin if smoke began filling the interior. Then he built a small fire in the firebox, just enough fuel to generate smoke and heat without creating overwhelming volume. The kindling caught, flames appeared, and smoke began rising. Klaus watched the firebox opening intently, waiting to see if smoke would climb into the chimney or spill into his cabin. The smoke hesitated. It rose from the flames, hit the firebox top, and seemed uncertain about direction. Wisps began curling forward into the cabin. Klaus fought the urge to panic and forced himself to wait. Chimneys needed time to establish draft, especially when completely cold. The smoke continued wavering, some rising toward the channels, some drifting into the cabin. Klaus's eyes began watering. Then, gradually, the draft caught. The smoke column steadied and began flowing rearward into the channel system. Klaus added more wood. The fire grew stronger. The smoke flow stabilized, pulling consistently toward the channels and up through the chimney. No smoke entered the cabin. The first test seemed successful, but success was partial. As the fire burned hotter, Klaus heard a sound that concerned him. A low rumbling came from inside the stone mass, the sound of turbulent air moving through restricted passages. The channel system was creating back pressure, restricting flow enough to cause turbulence. This could mean several things, none good. The channels might be too small. The turns might be too sharp. The vertical connectors might lack sufficient height. Klaus couldn't diagnose the specific problem without tearing open the structure, which was impossible. He let the fire burn down naturally, studying the smoke behavior as flames diminished. The turbulence persisted throughout, never resolving into smooth flow. Samuel Crawford appeared at Klaus's door that evening, drawn by the unusual chimney smoke. "Well," he asked, "does your castle work?" Klaus explained the partial success and the turbulence problem. Samuel's expression said what Klaus already knew. 5 months of work had produced a structure with fundamental flaws. The mockery Klaus had endured would intensify, but Samuel surprised him with his response. "Can you fix it without starting over?" Klaus considered the question. Maybe. If he modified the chimney height, adjusted damper positions, altered the draft characteristics, he might resolve the turbulence. It would require more experimentation, more time. Samuel nodded. "Then you're not done yet." Klaus spent 3 weeks in October modifying the stove's draft characteristics through systematic trial and error. He couldn't alter the internal channels without demolishing the structure, so he focused on elements he could change. He extended the chimney height by adding 2 feet of additional stone, increasing the draft pull that drove smoke through the system. He adjusted the air intake under the firebox grate, restricting flow to create more pressure in the combustion chamber. He modified the dampers that controlled flow between channel sections, experimenting with different positions to find optimal settings. Each change required a test fire, observation of smoke behavior, analysis of results, and decision about next modification. The process was frustrating and meticulous. Small changes produced unexpectedly large effects. Adding just 6 inches to chimney height noticeably improved draft, but also increased the turbulence Klaus was trying to eliminate. Restricting air intake smoothed flow, but made starting fires difficult. The variables interacted in ways Klaus struggled to predict, and each test consumed wood and time. His neighbors watched smoke rising from his chimney at odd hours, seeing evidence of continued experimentation. The consensus was that Klaus was stubbornly refusing to admit failure, throwing good effort after bad, unable to accept that his foreign ideas didn't translate to American conditions. The breakthrough came during a test fire on October 28th. Klaus had modified the primary damper position, moving it 3 inches higher than previous placement, creating a slightly different flow pattern through the first channel section. He lit the fire, expecting another incremental improvement at best. Instead, the turbulence that had plagued every previous test simply disappeared. Smoke flowed through the channels with a smooth, steady pull. The rumbling sound was gone. The draft was strong and consistent. Klaus sat watching in disbelief as the fire burned exactly as intended, smoke vanishing into the stone mass with quiet efficiency. He let that fire burn hot for 2 hours, feeding it consistently to test the system under sustained load. The smooth flow continued. More importantly, the stone mass began showing the behavior Klaus had hoped for. The surface temperature rose gradually as the fire burned, the stone absorbing heat that would have escaped through a conventional chimney. Klaus placed his hand against the stove's exterior surface and felt warmth spreading through the mass. Not surface heat that would dissipate quickly, but deep warmth that indicated the entire structure was capturing thermal energy. He fed the fire until it consumed itself completely to ash, then closed the dampers and waited. The stove held its heat. 2 hours after the fire died, the surface was still warm to touch. 4 hours later, warmth continued radiating into the cabin. Klaus maintained careful measurements throughout that first successful test. The outdoor temperature was 38 degrees. His cabin, with no active fire, held at 56 degrees 6 hours after the fire burned out. A standard fireplace would have left the cabin at outdoor temperature within an hour. Klaus had proven the principle worked. Now he needed to prove it would work through Montana winter. The first serious cold arrived on December 9, 1841, dropping temperatures to -32 degrees overnight. Klaus woke before dawn to a cabin that felt comfortably cool but not cold, the stove still radiating heat from the fire he had built the previous evening. He added wood to the firebox, building a hot fire that would burn for 90 minutes, and went about his morning routine while the stone mass absorbed heat. By the time the fire consumed itself to ash, the cabin temperature had risen to 68 degrees. Klaus closed the dampers, ate breakfast, and prepared to check his trap lines. He returned in late afternoon to find the cabin still holding at 55 degrees, despite the brutal outdoor cold. He built another fire, his second of the day, and watched as the temperature climbed back into the comfortable range. The wood consumption was startling in its efficiency. Klaus had burned perhaps 8 logs total, split pieces that would have lasted maybe 2 hours in a conventional fireplace. Those 8 logs had kept his cabin warm for an entire day in conditions that would have required constant fire using American methods. Klaus kept detailed records, noting outdoor temperature, indoor temperature, wood consumed, and firing schedule. The data was undeniable. His neighbors were burning through wood at catastrophic rates. Samuel Crawford's cabin, a quarter-mile away, showed smoke rising from the chimney constantly day and night. Klaus knew Samuel was feeding his fireplace every few hours just to maintain barely tolerable conditions. The effort was exhausting and unsustainable. Other settlers were facing similar struggles. The settlement's general store reported unprecedented demand for axes and saws as men scrambled to cut more wood, their carefully prepared winter supplies depleting far faster than anticipated. The cold snap was severe even by Montana standards, testing every cabin and every heating system in the territory. Klaus's wood consumption remained minimal. He fired his stove twice daily, morning and evening, each fire burning hot and fast. The rest of the time, the massive stone structure radiated stored heat with steady persistence. The cabin stayed between 65 and 75 degrees regardless of outdoor conditions. Klaus could work inside without heavy clothing. His water bucket never showed ice. He slept comfortably under a single blanket. The contrast between his situation and his neighbor's desperation was becoming impossible to ignore. Smoke rising from Klaus's chimney appeared only twice daily for brief periods, while other cabins showed constant smoke indicating continuous burning. Porter arrived on December 15th, claiming he was checking on Klaus after the severe cold. But Klaus saw through the pretense. Porter wanted to see if the German stove was actually working, or if Klaus was suffering in silence, too proud to admit failure. Klaus invited him inside. Porter stepped through the door and stopped immediately, his expression shifting from skepticism to confusion to something approaching wonder. "How is it this warm?" Klaus gestured toward the dark stone mass radiating heat with quiet efficiency. Porter moved closer to the stove, placing his hand against the surface, feeling warmth that had no visible source. No fire burned, no flames showed, yet the stone gave heat as steadily as summer sun on rock. Word spread through the scattered settlement community that Klaus Eisenhardt's cabin defied the brutal winter that was breaking other men. Trappers and settlers began finding reasons to visit, drawn by curiosity and the need to verify stories that seemed implausible. They arrived expecting to find exaggeration or misunderstanding, some trick of perception that explained the reports. Instead, they found a cabin that felt like a different season existed inside its walls. The contrast between exterior cold and interior comfort was so stark that men would stand in the doorway repeatedly stepping in and out, testing whether their senses were deceiving them. Samuel Crawford brought a thermometer on December 20th, a mercury instrument he had purchased years earlier for tracking weather patterns. He hung it outside Klaus's cabin and watched it drop to -35. Then he brought it inside and watched it climb to 70 degrees. He checked it multiple times, suspecting malfunction, but the instrument was accurate. Klaus's cabin was genuinely 68 to 70 degrees warmer than the outside air, maintained by a heating system that showed no active fire and consumed wood at a rate that seemed physically impossible by conventional understanding. The visitors examined the stove from every angle, trying to comprehend how it worked. Klaus explained patiently, repeatedly, the same principles his grandmother had taught him. The stone captured heat that conventional fireplaces wasted. The internal channels maximized heat transfer from smoke to mass. The thermal inertia meant the stone was slow to heat, but equally slow to cool. The physics were straightforward, but they contradicted everything frontier experience had taught these men about heating. They knew fire gave heat. They understood that more fire gave more heat. The concept of stored heat, of stone acting as a thermal battery, existed outside their framework. Klaus's woodpile provided visible proof of the system's efficiency. His neighbors had burned through half their winter supplies by late December. Klaus's pile looked barely touched. Men stood studying it, counting remaining logs, calculating consumption rates that didn't match their experience. Porter did the mathematics publicly, estimating Klaus was using 1/8 the wood that conventional heating required. The number seemed impossible until men checked their own depleted wood piles and compared them to Klaus's abundance. The evidence was irrefutable, even if the mechanism remained mysterious to many observers. Duchamp, the French-Canadian trapper, returned to Klaus's cabin multiple times during late December. He spoke broken English, but communicated his questions through gesture and drawing. He sketched the stove's profile, indicating the internal structure he couldn't see. Klaus drew the channel system, showing the smoke path through the stone mass. Duchamp studied these drawings intently, nodding slowly. Finally, he spoke a single word that Klaus understood despite the language barrier. Wise. Not lucky, not strange, not foreign. Wise. Duchamp saw what others were beginning to recognize. Klaus had solved a fundamental problem through knowledge rather than brute force. The respect in Duchamp's eyes told Klaus that vindication was arriving, slowly but certainly, carried by winter's brutal testimony. Klaus maintained meticulous records throughout the winter of 1841 to 1842, documenting data that would prove the Russian stove's performance beyond subjective impression. Each morning he recorded outdoor temperature, indoor temperature before firing, wood consumed in the morning fire, and indoor temperature after the stone mass heated. Each evening he repeated the measurements. The resulting logbook became a detailed portrait of thermal efficiency that even the most skeptical settler could not dismiss. Numbers did not lie, and Klaus's numbers told a story that contradicted generations of frontier heating assumptions. The daily wood consumption averaged 12 logs per 24-hour period during the coldest weeks when outdoor temperatures remained below -20. Each log was split pine or fir, approximately 16 inches long and 4 inches in diameter. Klaus fired the stove twice daily, burning 6 logs per firing in hot, complete combustion that lasted 60 to 90 minutes. The rest of the time, the stone mass radiated stored heat with no additional fuel required. By contrast, Samuel Crawford reported burning 28 to 35 logs per day in his conventional fireplace to maintain barely tolerable interior temperatures. The ratio was roughly 1 to 3, meaning Klaus used 1/3 the fuel Samuel consumed. Interior temperature stability was equally dramatic. Klaus's cabin maintained temperatures between 65 and 75 degrees, regardless of outdoor conditions. The variation was roughly 10 degrees over a full 24-hour cycle, with coolest temperatures occurring just before morning firing and warmest temperatures appearing 2 to 3 hours after each fire. Samuel's cabin, by his own admission, varied from 45 degrees when the fire burned actively to as low as 25 degrees during the night, when exhaustion forced him to sleep rather than feed flames. The 40 to 50 degree temperature swing made rest difficult and cold-related illness common. The financial implications were substantial. Wood represented labor, and labor represented survival capacity. Every hour a man spent cutting firewood was an hour not spent trapping, hunting, processing pelts, or maintaining equipment. Klaus calculated that Samuel spent approximately 4 hours daily on firewood procurement and processing. Klaus spent perhaps 90 minutes every third day, a reduction of roughly 85%. Over a full winter, that represented hundreds of hours of freed labor that Klaus could direct toward productive activities. The efficiency gained was not merely comfort, but economic advantage that would compound over multiple seasons. Klaus shared his data freely with anyone who asked. He showed his logbook to Porter, Samuel, Duchamp, and others who visited during January and February. Some men copied the numbers into their own records, taking the information back to their cabins to study. Porter asked permission to take Klaus's logbook to the settlement trading post, where it could be reviewed by the wider community. Klaus agreed. The logbook circulated through the scattered settlements for 3 weeks, examined by perhaps 20 different men who were struggling through the brutal winter. When it returned to Klaus in late February, several pages contained annotations and questions written by readers trying to understand the principles behind the performance. Spring arrived in late March of 1842, and with the thaw came a steady stream of visitors to Klaus Eisenhardt's cabin. These were not casual observers or skeptical mockers, but men who had survived a brutal winter and recognized that Klaus's heating system represented genuinely superior technology. They came with questions about construction techniques, material requirements, and design principles. Samuel Crawford was the first to formally request instruction. He arrived on April 2nd with a proposal. If Klaus would teach him to build a masonry heater, Samuel would provide labor assistance and share the cost of specialized tools needed for the work. Klaus agreed without hesitation. He had never intended to keep the knowledge proprietary. The information had saved his life, and withholding it from others who faced the same dangers seemed both selfish and foolish. Over the next week, Klaus and Samuel discussed design requirements, stone selection criteria, and construction sequence. Samuel took detailed notes, asking questions that revealed he had been thinking carefully about the principles involved. He wanted to understand not just how to build the stove, but why each element mattered. Klaus appreciated the seriousness of Samuel's approach. This was not casual interest, but committed intent to replicate proven success. By mid-April, 3 other settlers had made similar requests. Porter arrived with specific questions about channel sizing and draft calculations. Duchamp brought drawings showing a modified design he was considering, adapted for a smaller cabin. A settler named Henderson asked whether the system could be scaled up for a larger structure housing multiple families. Klaus worked with each man individually, explaining principles and helping them plan their specific projects. The conversations revealed that Klaus's innovation was being taken seriously not as foreign curiosity, but as practical frontier technology worth adopting. Construction began in May across multiple sites. Samuel started first, with Klaus providing regular consultation and hands-on assistance during critical phases. Porter began his project 3 weeks later, incorporating modifications based on lessons from Samuel's construction. Duchamp worked on his smaller design, proving that the principles scaled down effectively. By late June, 4 masonry heaters were under construction within a 20-mile radius of Klaus's original cabin. The technique was spreading through demonstration and shared knowledge rather than formal instruction or commercial transaction. The cultural significance was subtle but real. These were American settlers, men raised in traditions of English-style open fireplaces, choosing to adopt a European heating technology because performance trumped tradition. The decision required humility, the acknowledgement that frontier wisdom was not always wise, and that solutions from other places might work better than inherited methods. Klaus watched his neighbors build their stoves and recognized that something larger than heating technology was shifting. The frontier was learning that survival favored adaptation over stubbornness, that the best idea mattered more than the idea's origin. Winter had been the teacher, and the lesson was spreading. Klaus Eisenhardt left the Montana Territory in 1849. Part of the larger migration westward as the fur trade collapsed and new opportunities emerged in Oregon and California. He sold his claim to a family newly arrived from Wisconsin, and during the transaction, he spent 2 full days teaching the new owners how to operate the masonry heater properly. The instruction covered firing technique, maintenance requirements, ash removal, and seasonal adjustments. The family listened carefully, recognizing they were receiving knowledge more valuable than the cabin itself. Klaus departed, knowing his innovation would continue serving its purpose under new stewardship. The stove he built remained functional for decades. The Wisconsin family lived in that cabin for 12 years, then sold to another settler who occupied it through the 1860s and 70s. Each successive owner maintained the structure carefully, recognizing its value. By the 1880s, the cabin had become a known landmark in the region, identified by locals as the Old German's Place, even though Klaus's name had been largely forgotten. The masonry heater still functioned, still provided efficient heat, still demonstrated principles that Klaus had implemented 40 years earlier based on his grandmother's teaching and his own determination not to freeze like Thomas Macklin. The technique spread beyond Klaus's direct influence through organic transmission between settlers. Men who had learned from Klaus taught others. Those secondary students taught a third generation. By the 1850s, masonry heaters appeared in settlements across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho territories, particularly in areas with harsh winters where heating efficiency meant survival. The designs varied as different builders adapted the core principles to available materials and specific needs. Some heaters were larger than Klaus's original, others smaller. Some incorporated cooking surfaces, others focused purely on heating. But all shared the fundamental innovation: internal channels that captured waste heat and thermal mass that stored it for gradual release. Historical records from the period show scattered references to these heating systems under various names. Some documents call them Russian stoves, others German heaters. A few use the term contraflow fireplaces. The inconsistent terminology reflected the technology's multiple entry points into American frontier culture. Klaus was not the only European immigrant who brought masonry heater knowledge westward, but his contribution was significant and documented through the accounts of men who learned directly from him and recorded their experiences in journals and letters. Modern historians estimate that masonry heaters built during the 1840s through 1870s saved numerous lives by reducing hypothermia risk, decreasing wood-gathering labor that exposed men to danger, and providing stable interior temperatures that prevented cold-related illness. The exact number cannot be calculated, but survival often goes unrecorded while death generates documentation. The absence of freezing deaths in cabins with masonry heaters, compared to continued mortality in cabins with conventional fireplaces, suggests Klaus's innovation and its spread through frontier communities had measurable impact on human survival in one of North America's harshest environments. Engineering over mockery. Knowledge over tradition. The quiet legacy of a man who refused to accept that American methods were the only methods, carved into stone and heat and the simple fact of warmth when winter said there should be none.